Hello. This is the Reading Rainbow Emperor. Sorry for the delay in review video. Things have been changing rapidly, and I haven't been able to keep track of, the less, shall we say, profitable things in life, while maintaining my sanity. This is a series of off the cuff, not that I'm wearing cuffs right now. Oh, what a pity for the ladies. Of off-the-cuff videos about Jonathan Joestar and all the other Joestar, you know, bros that, not the bros, excuse me, the Joestars, there we go, all the other Joestars who, make up the main characters of the JoJo's Bizarre Adventure series. And this is not in a sort of how do I want to say this? Not in a sort of like, here's all their abilities sort of way, but rather what they mean for the cast and characters. Like, what's their effect? And I'm going to start with Jonathan Joestar, because that is where you start with Jonathan Joestar. It's how you develop the next five protagonists directly, and the next two indirectly. Well, Gappy is a little different, and I'll talk about him in a bit. So, Jonathan Joestar, I've talked about him before. He's the good boy. He is the ideal hero. He doesn't really ever break his, shall we say, moral code, though that isn't quite right. It's more that he doesn't think outside of his moral code. He is, if Araki understood Christianity, he would be a good Christian boy in a sort of knightly chivalry sense. And the reason why he is the most important Joestar is because he is the one that is the foundation for all the rest. Why? Why does a foundation that comes from one man, one Joestar matter so much? In long-running series, you see, the first book is the most important. Almost. No, it is the most important, because how would people get into your series otherwise? What would bring them to the last book of your series, if not the first book? You see, I've even heard of people who read the first book and last book of the series just to see how it goes. I assume these were in times before TV tropes was a universal word. But that's neither here nor there. You see, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Phantom Blood is the similar sort of thing. It draws in a lot of people, even though people will rarely claim it's their most favoritist of all the JoJo's Bizarre Adventures. That's usually reserved for number 2. It's more than good enough to keep people going. You see, there are two types of JoJo fans. Ones who sort of randomly picked and pecked around until they found something they really liked, and then of course they're hooked forever. Or the ones who started at the beginning and are currently awaiting to see how Part 8 ends. And hopefully it'll end this year, but probably not at the rate the plot is going. He's building up to something, but it's like, there's still one more round before Kato, who is likely to be the main villain. But Jonathan Joestar, not Johnny Joestar. Johnny Joestar is his opposite in a very interesting way. But Jonathan Joestar, because he is so good, he is such a bright light, it allows the rest of the series to have that spirit of luck and pluck, of goodness, of heroism, to continue on from generation to generation. Even Giorno, who doesn't have heroic desires, he wants to be a gang star, baby. still has that element of heroism, still has a goodness about him, even if he's, thieving from, unlucky, unwary tourists. Really, it's one of those things where you can't think of goodness in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure without thinking of Jonathan Joestar. And it's that bright light that illuminates the others, as I've mentioned. It allows Dio to be all the darker, and allows his evil deeds to be all the stronger. And even the deeds of those who are not, say, direct descendants of him, but still, how do I want to say this? Even if they're not direct descendants of him, they still have a potential. But life has that sort of way of dimming that brightness or darkness or whatever it happens to be. Giorno turned out to be heroic for a certain way, but the other sons of Dio turned out to be unheroic, evil even. Um, one of them tries to supplant Poochie, and then there's the effect of Poochie. It's like, of course he's evil. He was one of Dio's disciples. Like, it goes without saying that such a man would be evil, by definition's sake. So you have this white light and this shadowy darkness, and of course the white light wins. That's the proper story. But they have that similar effect because they clashed, because they spread out, because the light won. The darkness can never actually be in a position to win. Um, the villains aren't going to win. Like, they can win for a time. Nobody's saying that a villain can't win 1 or 2 battles or 3 battles or even 100 years worth of battles, as might be the case with Part 8. But what matters is, in the end, when the chips are down, when the stakes are raised, that the heroes answer the call, even as Jonathan Joestar did, despite his sorrow and anguish and all the rage he felt. The righteous anger that Dio would betray the hospitality of his father, would try to murder his father, and yet, he was still willing to treat Dio as a man. His honor and gracefulness, his personality, will never be something people can easily say, what a chump, he was kind of a chump. But then you read it for yourself and you realize these people are laughing at a knight, at a hero, at somebody who deserves honor, who deserves all the goodness and mercy and light of the world that was taken from him. It's a hard state of affairs to deny. The, people cannot say that Jonathan was never heroic. People cannot say that Dio was never evil. And they'll say they won't attack it that way, but rather they'll attack it by saying that because Dio and Jonathan were so simplistic in deeper philosophical character, it is thus a lesser work. But the thing is that if Steel Ball Run had come out in 1988 or 9 or whatever it was, it wouldn't have been successful. People would have hated Johnny Joestar, even though, like, let's just say that. Let's just go over it real quick. If Part 7 was put where Part 1 would have been, people would have hated Johnny Joestar. He wasn't in fashion. He wasn't a heroic character. Maybe Gyro Zappelli would have kept people around just because he's such an awesome guy. But the art style, the characterization, the villain, the weird stakes are so strange, so out of the blue, that it wouldn't have been successful. Like, Fist of the North Star had a lot of bizarre things, but it was based on the Mad Max rules. In other words, anything that could show up in the wasteland does, including a guy who throws dynamite as a martial art. It's that's actually very funny. It's very self-aware. But the Fist of the North Star guy, Kenshiro, I think his name is still a hero. You know, there's Cyber Blue. You know, the guy in there just murdered everyone who ever crossed him, but he was still a hero. He still wept over good men dying. You know, and it was so bad. It's such a bad manga, but it's a guilty pleasure of mine because everyone plays it so seriously. You know, these corrupt policemen and all that jazz. But JoJo's is the thing that survived from the era. Fist of the North Star is over. It's just being remade forever. Maybe we get a new movie of some kind, but the story's done. JoJo's isn't. Let's let's take it a look at another way, or like JoJolion. JoJolion wouldn't even have gotten a third of the way through it, you know, through its arc. You know, uh, Stone Ocean. You know, no, not even because, like, yeah, partially because, you know, boys don't really care as much for, like, girl heroes and that sort of style, unless you're primed for it, unless you understand it, unless it's relevant for the thing. And even then, their popularity went up after they introduced a couple of dudes to round out the cast. Um, it's true. You know, maybe uh, parts part three could have been started from the beginning where it was without any sort of priming. Maybe part five, but you'd have to take out the Koichi stuff, um, just so that there isn't any confusion. And then you could go back to talk about Dio and Jonathan, about this and about that. You know, it's it's hard if you look at it from a ideal logical narrative perspective to decide where the beginning point of JoJo should be if it shouldn't be part one. You might say, well, but what about part two? Part two depends on part one. The plot does not make sense unless you understand what the stone masks are, what the vampires are. Many of the reactions of the characters are based on what part one does. Speedwagon, Strazo, Joseph to a point, and sort of the Pillarmen. Though not because they directly know of what happened, it's more of the sense of where did the stone masks come from? And why are the stone masks inherently an evil object? Why do they lose their humanity? It's because their creators were evil. You know, and it's like, how can you like they chump so many vampires that it's like, you know, what's the threat of vampires? You know, if you got the Pillarmen, so on and so forth. You know, where one vampire caused difficulty, you know, Pillarmen, you know, it wouldn't have been the right flavor. It wouldn't have had the right weight. Instead, we go from part to part. Jonathan Joestar versus Dio. Dio has the stone masks, and there's the mystery of the stone masks. Um, Jonathan wins. Dio takes over Jonathan's. Dio kills Jonathan at the last second, and Erina survives. Part two. Erina still knows about Jonathan's heroism because she loved him and never took another lover. She raised the kids to have that same heroic ideal, and her son, George Joestar, dies heroically. But not before leaving, in the fashion of his father, but not before leaving Joseph Joestar in the care of Lisa and Erina. Lisa and Aaron, Lisa takes care of the vampire, etc., etc. We move on to actual part two. Because Jonathan won against Dio, because we know what a hero Jonathan is, it enhances Joseph's wit and charisma and his ability to think on his feet more. You know, Jonathan was very much a power through kind of guy, but Joseph is much more clever. It's a great contrast. You know, and he wins. And there's contrast between the villains like Cars and the villains like Dio. We move on to part three. Jotaro Kujo. He's an anti-hero, but extra emphasis on the hero. He's just the type of guy who doesn't, you know, he's like, you know, get away from me, you thoughts. You could describe his relationship with women. The funniest, one of the funnier comics I did is How Did He Get Married? He's just like, you know what I like. Yeah, and you're pretty handsome. How about you become my wife? Uh, we just know each other for 3 weeks. Yeah, but how about you become my wife? Okay. That's it's funny, but it tells a lot about his character. It's actually it feels very true to him because unlike Erina and Jonathan's romance, which we saw, or Joseph and sort of Susie Q, kind of, they make sense together. We never see his Jolene's mother except briefly in flashbacks, kind of thing. But because Jonathan's a hero, we know that no matter what sort of anti-hero Jotaro is, he will be heroic. He will make the right call. Then we have Jojo Part 4. Josuke, there we go. So we have Josuke. Josuke is much more traditionally heroic, but he's heroic, streetwise, rather than heroic, straight-laced. Thus, we get another contrast. He's not as clever as Joseph. He's not as anti-heroic as Jotaro, but he's much, much more like his great-granddaddy. More than he is his father, even. He's still streetwise. He's still a kid, and he's a kid of his era. But there's none of that same anti-heroism. He gets serious, and like I've heard some people contrast him with Jonathan about the fact that he um, you know that excuse me, that he's very vicious with some of the people he did, but the people he turned into inanimate objects were serial killers and people who picked on women and children. Like they, they were on vampire level morality here. They didn't care. Um, like Jonathan killed Dio. Dio was raised like his brother. Like that's a pretty strong bond, even though Dio was an a-hole from day one. Like even then, like if you grow up with somebody, even if you have problems with them, you still feel affection for them, and it actually causes conflict within Jonathan through the first part until Dio murders his father. He's like, he's we've been acting friends. Maybe it was just that. Am I a bad person for not trusting Dio? Like he thinks about these things, and then of course he's right not to trust Dio. But that's beside the point. This is Jonathan Joestar isn't a complicated man. Part 5. Uh, Part 5. Giorno Joestar. Giorno. Whatever his last name is. I like to think of him as a Joestar because it was Jonathan's body doing the deed. Producing the offspring. Uh, he has corrupted morals, but that's because he didn't have a father figure. And what father figure he did get was a gangster. So he wants to be a gangster, but he hates the drug trade. He in one of the books that was considered like sort of canon, um, like approved by the author sort of thing. He sends people after the drug makers to kill them. You know, that's very dark, but at the same time, it's not the worst. Like it's heroic in a gangster sort of way. Like I recently was reading Chainsaw Man, which is a comic you guys should read, and I might do something over it in a minute. Where this gangster's reminiscing about the villain that was killed in the first couple chapters, and he goes, he was a real great guy. He'd give you the coat off your back. You couldn't count on one hand the amount of women he killed. He was a good gangster sort of thing. Anytime you needed money, he was there for you. But of course we saw the thing where he tried to kill the main character, uh, and chop him up for parts to fill a debt. Uh, mm, it's like that's a matter of opinion, man. But to normal society, he is a villainous character. But we see that he's actually a very heroic character with villainous intentions. Jolene is probably one of the most realistic depictions of a fatherless or a uninterested, neglectful father I've ever seen in literature. She's lost her way. She has no idea what morality is. Her father and mother are divorced, and her dad is more obsessed with dolphins than he is her. It doesn't work out. So of course she gets in with a bad crowd. Of course, with no guiding light, no guiding morality, she has to face things alone that she wasn't ready for. She didn't have the strong backbone for. But the second she's given an opportunity to be a hero, she starts to take it. She fights to prevent the universe being reset to take down Poochie, and she sacrifices her life for Impario, without in a very heroic manner. It's one of those things where if she had been given a moral core, not that I'm saying she would have been as good as Jonathan, because again, her father's Jotaro Kujo, the anti-hero extraordinaire. She would have certainly had more shades of him than, Josuke or even Jotaro, just because of how she interacts with people and how she does with Foo Fighters and Hermes and all the other ones. Oftentimes she doesn't even want to sort of fight. She's just forced into it. And then there's revenge, and revenge is a dark motivator for those who don't understand how it eats at you. And again, no father figure to tell her different. And when he does show up, it's like too little too late, friendo, sort of thing. It's an awkward conversation. And it ends tragically for him. But that's just how it is sometimes. Now we get to part 7, where I should talk about the villains real quick. Part 3 is Dio again, so it's just Dio, except he's going crazy because he's like, I feel this Joestar blood. Then it's part 4, which is a serial killer, which is more about the opposite of Josuke than it is about Dio and other things, even though he does have connections to Dio. Diavolo is, how do I want to say this? He's more of, like, he's a less combat Dio. Dio wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, to experience pain and all that jazz. Part of it was him being a vampire, but also, he got into fights. He boxed. Like, it's as a human. Like, he wasn't afraid to do damage, but Diavolo certainly is. His endurance is like D or E, but his strength is A. Like, it's in his stand stats. Like, he's sort of like a bad, not a cowardly, because when it's time to act, he acts. It's more of a, I don't know, like an opposite version of Dio, who's more obsessed not with control and domination, but with control and domination, except secretly. Whereas Dio didn't mind being the king. Part 6, Poochie, who wants to inherit and complete Dio's will, is sort of like as if Jonathan Joestar had a son that actually got characterization in his own part, instead of just being like mentioned as a backstory. Like, it would be a similar sort of matchup where he inherits his father's will, the will of the person who means the most to him, and then tries to fulfill it as a good son should. Then we have part 7. Johnny Joestar works as a character in contrast to Jonathan Joestar, because he has to become a hero, whereas Jonathan had many of those traits innately in him. Johnny is selfish. He's verbally abused. He's mentally abused. He's guilt-ridden. He doesn't understand, what's going on, and he doesn't have that moral core. Jonathan's dad, I think it's Jojo Star or something ridiculous like that, taught him morality and manners and how a man should live. But Johnny Joestar's dad is nothing like him. Nothing. He's not evil, but he's certainly messed up, and he doesn't love Johnny as much as he loved his Johnny's elder brother. And it just piled on to him. And then, of course, he was, living a wasteful life, and he got shot in the back and lost his legs. And it's not, anyone who looks at part 7 is like, it's a quest to get his legs. No, it's a quest to become a man. Not a man as in a manly man, but rather men often have to become men. Like there's something that they go through to become men. That's his ordeal, and he comes out of it a man. He comes out of it a man among men's, but he's still damaged. He's still crippled on the inside. Unlike Jonathan, who experienced all this trauma, all this poor things happening to him. With saying, you know what, I'm not going to let it down, and I'm going to overcome everything before me, no matter what it costs me. Johnny can't do that. He can't give it up. He's not been trained the same. So when he's given an opportunity to, steal the corpse parts to try and save his son from some disease, he goes and does it. But not as a hero would. He steals it. He brings it back. He tries to make it work. But then he has to end up sacrificing his life for something that's never permanently solved, and in fact might have led to his family's downfall in Jojo. It's sad. It's a tragedy. Then we have President Valentine as the villain against him. Valentine has unselfish goals and motivations completely. He is obsessed with America and the benefits of America and how to do its best by America at all times. So when you have that sort of thing, somebody who's more outside of them than anything else, the scene where he begs for his life is not strange at all. It's not decreasing in his badass character. He's basically saying, look, I still want to do this. If you want this so bad, we can work it out. But I don't want to leave America. I don't want to leave my life behind because it's everything I've ever wanted to have. And I'll give you your heart's desire for my life. And Johnny can't do it. And President Valentine can't give up the fight. They're very similar characters, you see. But Johnny's the one who had the stronger will. And he was willing to give up more. And that's how it is. Then we have Part 8. Now, Part 8 is not done yet. And honestly, I don't like this part very much right now. Partially, the problem is that Gappy isn't a very heroic character like I would want him to be. There's just not a lot of what I like from Jojo in there. I like the crazy situations, but it's more of a character drama. I like the awesome stand fights, and I like kind of punching ghosts, but he's not as much that as he is a very clever hero. And honestly, he just doesn't have the character that many of the other people behind him have. He's just kind of a more goofy guy with amnesia. Josuke, who is spoilers, who's a part of him, has much more heroic characters, but because his mother neglected him, and it's implied he doesn't have a father, he's just led along by the nose by whoever takes care of him, in this case being Kira. Before spoilers. He's again a good example of somebody who doesn't have a father, who doesn't have these things there for him to give him that sense of justice. Josuke from Part 4 had his grandfather, who was a policeman, and his mother was there and loved him. But Josuke from this generation doesn't. And he falls, and he can't get back up. But he still has that loyalty that comes with being a Joestar towards the much more heroic Kira, and he sacrifices himself for him. And that's very good. It makes him a hero. It is within keeping of his character. And even though he doesn't quite have the same presence that other Joestars have in their own parts, he's still certainly a worthy member of the Joestar bloodline, provided, of course, Araki doesn't mess up the ending. The villain, sadly, is not directly released, so I'm not entirely sure how it connects in that sort of contrast comparison to Dio in the beginning. But that's how it is. Jonathan Joestar is my favorite character of the Joestars for many reasons. His heroism, his stalwartness, his death. Like, it's all just perfect. But that doesn't mean I need it repeated again and again. I needed him to make the series just right. And once we have him, everything else is just right. I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be working my way through JoJo's Bizarre Adventure and this sort of thing, talking about the heroes and what they mean to their own parts. This is meant as a foundational video to talk about it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.